Last week we talked about the two creation accounts found in the book of Genesis, and we saw that traditionally Christians have interpreted those as to be two different versions of the same thing. But when we really looked at them, we saw that they are not straightforward. They have to be examined very carefully. In fact, we saw that there are enough differences between them to open up the possibility that they are not two accounts of the same thing, but are accounts of two very different things. And as we saw last week, this opens up a number of other possibilities. The one we talked about was that Adam had a wife before Eve, a woman named Lilith. Although that's not a popular view within Christianity today, we saw that in some branches of ancient Judaism, it was apparently the way they looked at it. Today I thought it would be interesting to look some more at the first creation account in Genesis, and there's something very interesting in there. You may have picked up on it when I read that passage. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the first thing to notice is the phrase, the heavens. Now, I've read mine from the New King James Version, and it says the heavens, plural, and the earth. And that's actually the way most Bible translations put it, but actually the word is singular. God created heaven and earth. Now, the word heaven does double duty in the Bible. We've talked about this before. Sometimes the word heaven refers to what's up in the sky, like the sun and the moon and the stars and the clouds and all that. In other cases, it refers to heaven in the sense of where God is. And sometimes when the Bible uses the word heaven, you just have to look at the context of it to tell which it's talking about. And I think we can safely say in this context that it's talking about the sky and what's up in the sky, because that's what it's talking about. It's talking about God creating the world and the stuff up in the sky. It's interesting that the Bible does not ever speak of the origin of the heavenly realm. That is an issue that is never dealt with. So in Genesis 1 here, we know that God is talking about God creating the earth and stuff up in the sky, and they call that heaven. And it goes on and it says, the earth was without form and void. And so that means that the earth did not have a shape to it. It was just formless. It was a formless blob. And this is interesting right here, because science tells us that the earth started out as a formless blob of gas and matter, and then for some reason coalesced into a planet. And the Bible tells us here in Genesis chapter 1 that the earth started out as a formless blob of water. So, but both of them tell us that the earth started out as a formless blob and then was brought together. Now next it says, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the water. Now, you might hear something from some Bible translations like the Spirit of God moved across the face of the deep, but the word actually there is water. So that tells us that what the earth was made of to begin with, it was a formless blob of water with no defined shape to it. And then, oddly enough, it leaves that and it says, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So on that day, God created light. And so that was the first day. And so when God created the world, it was a formless blob of water, and then God created light. And then it goes on and it said, then God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the water, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. So we have a formless blob of water, and God makes a firmament. And a firmament is just, the Greek word there is something that means a solid structure. It is a solid structure that divides two things, and then what it divides is the water. It divides the waters from the earth to the waters above the earth. And so what you have here is an image of a solid structure with the waters being separated. So what are the waters of the sky? Well, that's rain. You know, there's water on the earth, and then there's water in the sky. When that water comes down, we call it rain. And so that's the imagery there. There's water up in the sky. It comes down to the earth, and the firmament is what holds the water up there. So this firmament now is apparently what created the shape of everything. Because remember, we used to have a formless blob of water, but now things are beginning to take shape. Some Bible translations, instead of firmament right now in that passage, will use the word vault, V-A-U-L-T. And that's not in the sense of a bank vault. It's the sense of like a vaulted ceiling. A vaulted ceiling in architecture is a curved, arched ceiling. And so in this creation account, the vault, the firmament, the curved, arched ceiling is what gives shape to everything. It gives the sky a curved shape. And you know, that's what the sky looks like when you look at it, go outside. The sky looks like a bowl turned upside down on the earth. You may have never thought of it that way, but it does. And you may have never thought about it this way either. I don't know if you've spent a lot of time flying in small airplanes, but if you do, you'll see that if you're in a small airplane, like at an altitude of 3, 4, 5,000 feet or something, when you look down at the earth looks like a bowl underneath you. And that's a lot of times how pilots judge their climb rate and descent rate, is your position relative to the bowl, the earth beneath you. So the firmament gives things the shape. It's the structure that supports things, that holds it together, and it divides the waters. Then God said, let the water under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. So up until now, we've seen nothing but water. And now in certain places, the waters recede so that we have dry land. That's on the third day. Now on that day, it also says, then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, and it was so. So on the third day, God created the dry land, and he created plant life on the dry land. And now moving on to the fourth day, it says, then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for years and days, let them be for lights in the firmament to give light on the earth. And it was so. Then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And this was on the fourth day. Now the greater light to rule the day is interpreted to refer to the sun. The lesser light to rule the night is interpreted to refer to the moon. And said on this day God made the sun, and he made the moon, and he made the stars. Now, did a light bulb go off in your mind there? What did God say on the first day? Let there be light. And there was light. But when did he make the sun and the moon and the stars? He made them on the fourth day. Now on the fifth day, God made the animals that live in the water. And God also made birds, the winged creatures that fly through the air. On the sixth day, God made the living things that move on the earth. And finally, as his last act of creation, he created man in his own image, male and female. He created them. Now let's go back and recap what we have. At first we have water, just a formless blob of water. Then we get some kind of light. And remember, it makes evening and morning, and day and night. But it can't be the light of the sun and the moon because those aren't created yet. Then the waters are divided into two parts, and the sky is made with a vaulted dome called the firmament. And there's now water down here, and apparently that firmament gives shape to everything, and there's water up above. The earth is no longer formless as it was. Then we get dry land. Then we get plant life and birds. Then we get the sun, Then we get plant life. Then we get the sun, moon, and stars. Then we get birds. And then we get animals. And then we get human beings. There are two things that stand out to me here. First of all, it started out as a formless blob of water. Water. Now, what's one of the most basic things you need to live is water. I mean, you cannot survive without water. That is a necessity of life, the way life is on earth. Now, if there's life other places, it may not, but it does here. And so water is one of the basic necessities of life, and we use water for many things. We use water not only to nourish our bodies, but water is also what makes, plants, animals, everything has to have water. We also use water for cleaning. We use water for cooking. Water is one of the main basic essentials that all life depends on. So that was that as a formless blob. Now the second thing that stands out to me is this issue of what's called light being created on the first day. And we hear that God said, let there be light, and there was light, and there was evening and morning, and that was the first day. And then on the second, the third day of creation, it says, and there was evening and morning in the first day. But the sun and the moon and the stars didn't get created till the fourth day. So what is this light that was created on the first day? Now a lot of people, if you read some of these things, people write, they say, well, this account in Genesis is just the account of some kind of legendary pre-scientific matter. Well, it does not take a scientific genius to figure out that the sun's what gives the light. I mean, you don't have to stand outside many times and notice that when the sun's up there, it's light, and when it goes down, it's dark. You don't have to be a genius. So don't think this thing of light coming on the scene before the sun was made as being a product of some primitive mind. You don't have to be a genius to know that it gets dark when the sun goes down. So whoever wrote that certainly had enough sense to know that. And they also certainly had enough sense to know that there was a seeming dissonance there, let there be light, and the sun and the moon and the stars not being created until the fourth day. So what is light? Light is used in the Bible to refer to something good. And light is used in the Bible to refer to God. In fact, the Bible says that God is light. We heard Jesus in our gospel reading say, I am the light of the world. And what is light associated with? It's associated with life. Light is associated with life. The book of James calls God the Father of lights. And the light. Now in Luke chapter 1, Zacharias was talking about his newborn son. Remember, this is the boy who would grow up to be John the Baptist. And he says this. He says that his son will be a prophet of God, to give knowledge of God's salvation through the tender mercy of God, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. And so in the Bible, light is associated with God. Light is associated with life. Darkness is associated with death. And so in Genesis, we see darkness, and then we see light. Now, it's a mystery, of course, as to what that author meant when he wrote that, how many ever thousands of years ago. But it's obviously not the light that we think of coming from the sun. Everybody who's come here for some time knows that I find the workings of the human body fascinating. The way the human body works. You see, I'm standing here looking out at all of you, and you're looking at me, and I see you. Think about what I see. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of light in this room. In scientific jargon, light is defined as electromagnetic radiation, radiating energy, so it's really electromagnetic energy. And light appears to move in waves. It doesn't move in a straight line. It oscillates back and forth in a wave pattern. And the length between the crest and the trough of each wave is how light is classified. At one end of the spectrum, there is light that has long wavelengths. Long wavelengths. And those are radio waves. Radio waves have long wavelengths. And they're in here right now. That's a form of light. They're in here right now. If you have a little portable radio, you can tune in radio stations around the county or in Charlotte. So you just can't hear it because your body doesn't pick up the radio waves. But they're in here right now. Now a little bit up the spectrum from radio waves are microwaves. It's a microwave oven at home. And then when you get on up a little more, there's something called infrared light. And we don't see that. But when you get to a certain part of it, it's what's called visible light. That's what we see. And above that's ultraviolet light. You know, sometimes they use ultraviolet light to show up blood stains or something on something after it's been washed. And then above that, even with a higher wavelength, are X-rays. And then there's something called gamma rays, from outer space. All that stuff now is in here. You know, all those broadcast stations, you know, one time you see how many stations we could pick up. We got one of those antennas that you plug in the wall, you know what I mean? You could look at the TV, and you get all these stations. We get like 30 or 40 channels with it up on the hill, you know, without using cable. All that stuff is coming in here right now. We're exposed to it right now. Everybody talking on cell phones, you get exposed to it. You know, all those signals are going through here right now. We just don't see it. Now, my eyes are sensitive to a certain wavelength of that, and that's what we call visible light. And a certain wavelength of light that bounces off your body comes and hits my eye, and it travels to the retina. And when it gets to the retina, it creates a chemical reaction which transmits an electrical pulse to a part of my brain, which then causes a chemical reaction in my brain. And my brain uses that chemical reaction to make an interpretation of you. And that's what I see. So you see, I'm not seeing you directly. I'm seeing an interpretation. My brain has stood on a chemical reaction that was triggered when a certain wavelength of light bounced off of you, hit the retina of my eye, created a chemical reaction there, and created an electrical impulse that created another chemical reaction in my brain. That's what I see. It's complicated, but I find it fascinating. Because, I really don't see you. I see a certain tiny wavelength of light reflecting off of you, and then my brain puts an interpretation on that. That's what I see. You see, all of our senses work the same way, whether it's sight, hearing, touch, taste, or smell. And what that means is we do not sense reality directly. We sense an interpretation our brain puts on chemical processes that happen when we come in contact with certain parts of reality. When I touch something, that triggers chemical reactions in my finger that trigger an electrical impulse that go to my brain that trigger another chemical reaction that my brain interprets. I don't feel this directly. What I feel is an interpretation my brain puts on it. And so our entire experience of the world is not a direct experience. Our entire experience of the world is an interpretation that our brain puts on chemical reactions that occur when we come into contact with parts of reality. That's why our senses are called our senses of perception. And perception, that word means something we grasp with our minds. Perceptions are in our minds. And our experience of reality is an interpretation inside our mind. We are isolated and insulated from reality because we experience it only indirectly. Now, scientists have isolated certain kinds of subatomic particles that exhibit something strange. They seem to react differently when someone's watching them. Of course, they're so small you can't really see them. They can just know what they did because of the effects. However, they act differently when we're watching them. See, as it's processed through our brain puts an interpretation. They become our brain's interpretation. And it may be that our brain's interpretation is not the same as their true action. You see, even science itself can't give us a true picture of reality because science itself is filtered through our human brain. Even science is an interpretation of the human brain. True reality, in other words, lies only with God. Our only direct contact with reality itself is our relationship with God. And that's something a lot of people don't realize. All the other ways we experience reality are interpretations, but our experience of God is reality as it really is. So what is that light that was brought into being on the first day? Well, it's obviously a light we can't see. But maybe it's important to note that whatever it was apparently the precondition for all other life. Because the light was made first. Even science does not really know what light is. They say it's electromagnetic energy, but really they can't explain to you what it is. They think what it does. They don't know what it is. Light, though, is energy. And energy is what makes life. So in Genesis, we have a statement. Before God created any life, He created light. He created the precondition or the foundation upon which life would exist. And so we can look at that as saying He created energy. Scientists tell us that even solid matter is nothing but energy confined. This table here is solid matter, but it's energy confined. They tell us that all matter is made of energy confined. Atoms are made of energy confined. Life is energy. You see, the way an atomic bomb works is because there's a lot of energy wound up into these pieces of matter. And when those pieces of matter are exploded apart, that energy is released, and that's an atomic bomb. So God made energy. And energy is what life depends on. You know, even science cannot explain what energy is. But here in Genesis, we have what I believe is a statement here. God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God is the author of light and life. And God is the author of what makes life. God is the author of energy. And so our true reality comes from God. And the only way we can experience true reality is with our experience of God.